Are you a software tester, a developer, or maybe anyone who wants to learn about APIs and their testing? Then this crash course is going to help you get started with that. My name is Parul Dang, and I have 5 years of test automation experience in web as well as REST API applications. Postman is my personal favorite tool to test APIs. And therefore, in this course, I have covered not only basic API terminology and how to test an API, but also how you can automate API testing in Postman.
Let me ask you a question. How many times have you created a new account by entering all the details manually into any new application you install? The number would be pretty low, because why would you want to create everything from scratch when you can simply use your Google account to log in into that application? How is this possible? Have you ever wondered how these two systems are communicating with each other? Or simply put, how data is being exchanged between Google and the new application? They might have been built in different programming languages or may have completely different architectures. Then what allows them to talk to each other? The answer is an API. Application Programming Interface, or API in short, is a mechanism that allows two systems to communicate with each other regardless of their underlying architecture. An API allows two systems to communicate with each other by producing data in a format which is understood by both the systems. Then what would you need to test in an API? The short answer is just data. You would like to verify whether your API is producing expected data or not after giving certain set of inputs. However, in addition to just verifying data, there might also be certain backend or database validations to make sure our API has taken a correct action on the server. Postman is freely available, lightweight, and easy to use tool to test your APIs. Whether you are a developer and want to quickly test your API under development, or a software tester who has to create an entire test suite of all the APIs under test, then Postman is a good choice to go to.
In order to use Postman, you have two choices. One is you can directly use Postman on its website, or you can choose to install it as a software. For both, you need to visit this website www.postman.com, where you will get all the same options to interact with Postman that you would get in its software. You can also click on this link, download desktop app, and a new tab should open, which will automatically detect the settings of your system and will give you a download option. Since I am using Windows, I am getting a download option for Windows. If you are using Mac or Linux operating systems, the steps would be same. Once I click on this button, my download should start. Once the download is completed, you simply need to double click on this exe and installation should start. And once the installation is completed, the Postman tool should be launched itself and you should see a screen like this. Before jumping to the Postman, I would like to cover basic API terminology that you must be aware of in order to use or test APIs. The first one comes request and response. The entire process of communication between two systems comprises of two steps. The caller system has to send a request, and in the answer, the callee system sends a response. And in order to send requests, there has to be a point of contact, which is called an endpoint. An endpoint is nothing but a request URL exposed by the server where you can send your requests. API calls are made to either fetch the information or take some action on the server. Such actions are described by API methods. What our API will do is represented by its method. For example, post is used to create something on the server, where put and patch are used to update something on the server. Similarly, delete goes to delete something and get is used to fetch some information from the server. There are a few other methods as well, but you are going to use these 5 for most of the time. Then comes API headers. Headers contain extra information of our API call, or we can say that headers hold metadata of our request. For example, if I want to specify that my API request body contains a JSON object, then I can specify this header content type whose value would be application JSON. This will let my server know that it should expect a JSON object body. Then comes request body. Request body is the actual data that you will be sending in your API call on which server will take certain action. There are other ways as well to send your data to the server. However, request body is the most secured way, especially when your API is creating, updating, or deleting something on the server. Generally, APIs ask to authenticate yourself to prevent the unauthorized access. Therefore, you may need to pass some extra information while making an API request, basis which server will recognize whether you are allowed to access the resource or not. There are many ways of authentication in API world, and one of them is bearer token. A token is nothing but an encrypted string which is active for some time, and you need to use that to make your API calls. Once you have made a successful request to a server, it will return you a response. And in the response, the first component would be a status code. Status code indicates the status of the request, whether it was successful, whether the action that was supposed to be taken has been taken, or was it a bad request. There is a long list of status codes that we'll come to know as we go throughout this course. The next component in the response is response body, which is the data sent by the server as a result of our request. The next component is response headers. They are just like request headers. They hold metadata information about a response. Enough of theory. Now let's quickly jump to the Postman. This is the first screen you are going to get when you launch Postman in your system. To create a new request, you need to click on this plus symbol. Once you click here, a new request form will open where you will need to enter your request details. This dropdown shows the list of all the request methods supported by Postman, and you need to select one for your request. Then comes the request URL section where you need to enter your request URL or endpoint where you want to send your requests to. Then we have this param section where we can enter the query parameters which we want to send to the server in our API request. Then we have auth section which allows you to enter the authentication information of your API request. Then we have headers tab to pass request API headers. Some of them are generated by Postman itself. And if you wish to pass any more headers, then you can enter on your own in key value pair. Now, if your API expects a request body, you can enter one in body tab. There are many ways to pass the request body, but most of the times we will be making use of form URL encoded or raw format. In form URL encoded, you can pass information in key value pair, whereas in raw format, you can choose to type the entire request body on your own in various formats supported, like JSON or XML. Then we have this pre-request tab where we can write some code which will be executed before calling the server. And then we can write some code in tests tab which will be executed once we have received a response from the server. Both of these tabs are used in automation which we'll cover later. Then we have settings tab which is used to update Postman settings or configuration which will be applicable only to this particular request. Once you have configured your request, you can click on this send button which will make a request to the configured endpoint. And whatever the response would be returned by the server in return will be visible in the response tab. Now it's time to send our first request in Postman. This is a website called http://bin.org which contains some freely available and open to use endpoints that you can make use of while learning Postman. If you scroll down, there are various categories, and in each of them there are multiple endpoints available that you can call. Now, if you click on any of the endpoints, then you can get further information about it. Like, does it take any query parameters, or if it takes request body, and if it does, then what is going to be its format, and what all key value pairs does it take? Correspondingly, what responses it can generate, what status code we can expect in response, and does it produce any response, and if it does, then what is going to be its format? It's like an API specification. which holds all the information about your API that you need to test it. If you have been asked to test some API but have not been provided this API spec, then this is something that you should be looking for before testing your API. Now let's make a call to this endpoint. In order to make a call, I'll need its base URL, which is given here. So my request URL will start from base URL, and then I'll need to append delete at the end. I'll also need to make sure I use delete method. I have already entered all the details in my Postman. I have entered base URL, endpoint, and also selected the corresponding method. Since this endpoint does not take any query parameters or request body, so let's quickly click on this send button. So this is the response which has been returned by the server, or you can say it's a response body. Then here is the status code, which is 200. If you want to see if server has returned any response headers, then you can simply select headers from here and it will show the list of all the response headers. If you can recall the second lecture I had mentioned, an API allows two systems to communicate by producing data in a format which is understood by both the systems. Now the question is, why do we need such common format? Let's say there are two systems, one developed in Java and another in Python, and we want to integrate them. We won't be able to do that directly because of the difference in their syntax. Then how would we do that? The solution is by making use of some third language or notation which is understood by both the programming languages Java and Python. JSON and XML are widely used examples of such common formats. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, where XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. Both of them are data interchange formats which are understood by most of the programming languages. Therefore, this format is the key which makes the communication possible between two systems regardless of their architecture. In JSON object, you can pass information in key value pair, whereas in XML schema, information is passed in user defined tags. In the scope of this course, we'll only talk about JSON in detail. However, if your API produces data in XML format, then learning XML will also not be a big challenge for you. Now let's try another endpoint with query parameters. Query parameters get appended to the end of the request URL. So you can either choose to pass them under this params tab in the form of key value pair, or you can directly append them at the end of the request URL. So let's try first mechanism by entering query parameters in key value pair. Let's say my first parameter is ID, whose value, let's say, is 1. And then another parameter is user, whose value I can pass, let's say, Parul. So if you notice, both of them are appended at the end of the URL. Now I can also choose to directly append these query parameters at the end of my URL. Let's try that way. Now, in order to append query parameters directly, I'll have to start with the question mark symbol, and then I'll enter my first query parameter, which is ID, and then equals and the value of this parameter. Now for second parameter, I'll have to first enter ampersand symbol, and then I can enter my second query parameter. Similarly, for third parameter, first enter ampersand and then enter third parameter. So in order to separate the query parameters, we have to use ampersand symbol. Since this API is for practice and has been designed in a way to return whatever you pass. Therefore, once we click on the send button, all the three query parameters that we passed have been returned in the response under arguments object. Now let's try another endpoint for authentication. There are various endpoints available on this website for authentication methods, but I am using bearer token for this demonstration. Since this endpoints requires a bearer token, I'll have to go to Auth tab and then select bearer token from here. And then in the token field, you need to enter the token that you would have obtained from some other endpoint. Since this API is for practice, so I can enter any random value here. And now if I click on send button, then it will simply return me the token that I passed. Now let's see how do we pass JSON request object body. In order to do that, simply click on this body tab and then select raw from here and then select JSON format. In JSON, there is either a single object or list of objects. For single object, you have to pass your key value pairs within a pair of curly braces. And if you have to pass a list, then you have to pass everything within a pair of square brackets. In the single JSON object, key values are separated by commas, and JSON keys are strings. Therefore, they go within double quotes. Let's say my first parameter is ID. Since it's a key, therefore it will go in double quotes. And then I'll have to pass a colon and then its value. Let's say its value is 1, which is numeric. Therefore, it will not go in double quotes. Then I will press a comma and then another parameter that I want to pass in this request body, which is, let's say, user. Again a key, therefore double quotes, and then a colon, and the value of user is, let's say, Dang Parul, which is again a string, therefore it will also go in double quotes. Now there can also be some keys which accepts more than one value. For example, hobbies, whose values can be more than one. Therefore, we'll be passing a list in its value. Let's see how. A comma here, and then hobbies key. Now in the value, I'll first type a pair of square brackets. And then within this square bracket pair, I'll simply pass the values. For example, programming, then comma, and then my second value, which can be, like, let's say, reading. Now let's click on send button and see if this request body has been accepted by the server or not. Yeah. So if you see here, there is an object called JSON in which it is returning the entire JSON that I passed in my request body. If I have to test this API, then what all points I need to validate? The first thing is status code. If the status code is as per the API specification, it means my request was successful. Second thing I need to validate is response body. In the context of this API, if the past request body is getting returned in the response, we can say that this API is working fine. Now, what if we could automate this verification? That is verification of status code and verification of response body. Then I would have tested thousands of APIs like this in just no time. Thanks to Postman, it provides a facility to automate your API testing. Let's quickly jump to the tests tab where we can write our own code to automate the verification of our response. All the code that you will write here will be executed once we have received a response from the server. You can click on this arrow symbol and you will get a list of code snippets which are frequently used to automate API testing. To verify status code, let's click here. So it will generate a snippet which will validate whether the status code of my request is 200 or not. Now let's run it. And once you have received a response, simply select test results from here. It will show whether the test case that you wrote is pass or fail. Now let's understand the code that has been generated. The first object is PM, which stands for Postman. It's Postman's implicit object, and we are making call to its test method. This method describes an automated test. The first argument to this method is the name of the test case, and second argument it takes is a function which will be executed to validate whether the test case was pass or fail. And within the body of this function goes a line of code written in chai.js BDD format, which is simply validating that our response should have a status code of 200. Similarly, if I have to validate whether the response headers has a particular header or not, I can simply use this snippet. This code snippet is validating whether the content type header is present in the response headers or not. Similarly, I have to make sure the response time is within a certain threshold. I can make use of this snippet. This snippet is validating the response time is less than 200 milliseconds. Well, let's change it to 800 milliseconds for our case. Let's see if the response is getting generated within 800 milliseconds or not. Let's hit send. Yeah. So all the test cases I had in my request are pass. In the next video, we'll see how can we automate the verification of response body.
So when I say we have to automate the verification of response body, what exactly I mean is we need to check whether certain information is available in the response body or not through automation. And in terms of JSON, we need to validate whether a particular key exists within the response body or not. And if it does, then does it have expected value? And in order to access a JSON object, you must know how information is stored in a JSON.
You must remember two things in order to access or store information in a JSON. The first one is object. An object represents one single thing. It may hold information about a, let's say, student or a course or let's say a teacher. So one object means one single thing. In JSON, an object is represented by a pair of curly braces. All the key value pairs which hold information about one single thing go within a pair of curly braces. And a list is represented by a pair of square brackets. A list is basically a collection of more than one things. And these things can be strings, numbers, booleans, and JSON objects as well. As I just mentioned, a list can also hold JSON objects. And if you can see on the screen, it's a list in which there are two objects. And we can say that it's a list of two students. Now, it's also not necessary that a key will always hold either a string, integer, or a boolean. A key may also hold further a nested object. If you can see on the screen, there is a student object in which the course key further holds an object. Similarly, a key may also hold a list. For example, the hobbies key here is basically a list which contains two values. So if you have noticed, everything in JSON is around objects and lists only. That's what you need to understand in order to access or create a JSON. Now let's quickly hop to the Postman to see how we can automate the verification of JSON response. This is the response that we had obtained in our last request, and it starts from a curly bracket, which means the response of this particular request is a single JSON object. Then we have the first key of this object, which is arguments, and the value of this key is basically again an object which is empty at the moment. Then we have data key, and then comes files, similarly form, and then we have headers key, which is further an object and is not empty. It also holds some information about the headers. Then we have another object which is JSON, and then in the JSON object, it's basically the request body that we have passed. And then we have origin and URL keys whose values are basically strings. Now let's say I want to verify that my response should have a JSON key, which basically is the request body that I have passed. Let's see how we can automate it. This time we'll write entire code on our own. First of all, we need to access the entire JSON and store it in some variable. Let's see how we can do that. Here I'm declaring a variable called JSON data, which will hold my entire response body. And the response body will be accessed using PM object, which is Postman. And then we'll type response, and at the end we'll type a JSON method, which will basically access the entire response and will store it in a JSON data variable. Now let's print this JSON data variable to make sure the entire response is getting stored in this variable. And in order to do that, let's type console.log and pass JSON data variable here. Now if you run it, it should print the JSON data variable. To access the console, you need to click here and it will show if the variable is getting printed, and yes, it is printing the entire response. Therefore, it means everything is fine until here. Now let me quickly close the console and delete this line of code. And coming back to our test, we need to validate there should be JSON key present in our response. So for that, let's create a test, which is done using pm.test method. And the first argument to this method goes the name of the test, which can be, let's say, JSON key should be present. And the second argument will be a function which will be executed to evaluate whether the test was passed or failed. Now let's create a function here which will have the actual code which will be used to evaluate the test. And here I am going to make use of another method called pm.expect. This method is like you are saying Postman to expect something within something. So here I am expecting JSON data variable to have a property called JSON. So I will pass JSON data variable to this expect method, and then I will type to dot have dot property. And in the property, I will pass JSON in a string. So now it's saying that expect JSON data variable to have a property called JSON. Now let's see if it passes or fails. If I go to test results, and yes, it passes. Now let's change the key and make it, kind of typo error. And let's see if it passes. No, it fails. Now let's write another test.
Now I want to validate the value of ID and I want to make sure, the value of ID is 1. Let's see how we'll do it. First of all, let's create another test. And the name of this test can be anything that you like. And then we'll have to create a function. And within this function, let's make a call to pm.expect method again. Here we are expecting the value of ID should be 1. And ID is a key within the response. Therefore, we need to traverse to this key in our response. And the entire response is stored in this JSON data variable. So in order to reach out to the keys within a response, stored in a variable, we have to use dot operator. Let's see how we'll do it. So let's type JSON data here. Now this JSON data holds this entire response starting from this line number 1 to line number 27. And I see ID is a key within a JSON object. And this a JSON object is further an object within the main object. Therefore, first of all, I need to access this JSON object. So let's type JSON here after dot operator. Once I type dot JSON, now the scope has been limited to this JSON object only. And now further I want to navigate to this ID key. Similarly, I'll use another dot operator and will type ID key. Now we expect the value of ID key to be equals to 1. So for that purpose, let's type 2 dot eql, which means equals, and then we pass the expected value here, which is 1 for our case. Now let's quickly run this test and see whether it passes or fails. And yes, it passes. Now let me quickly change the value and make sure it fails as well. And yes, it fails for 2. And now in our third test, we'll access a value within a list. If you notice here, the hobbies key within a JSON object is basically a list. And I want to test the first value of hobbies key is programming. Now, in order to access any value within a list, you have to access it using its index. Please note, the indices of lists are 0 based, which means that the first value will be stored at 0 index, second value at the first index, and so on. Now let's create our third test. Let's name it as hobbies should have expected value at index 0. And let's create a function which will again have another method called pm.expect. And within this expect method, we have to go to the hobbies key, which is again a key within a JSON object, which is again a key within the main object. So similarly, we'll start from JSON data variable, which holds the entire response, and then put a dot operator, and then the key called JSON. And within that JSON object, we have the key called hobbies. Now, since hobbies is a list, we'll have to put a square bracket here. And then within this square brackets, we'll have to pass the index that we want to access. So for this case, let's type 0. So it will give me the value stored at 0th index in the hobbies key. And I expect it to be equals to programming. So similarly, let's type 2 dot equals. And then within equals method, let's type the expected value, which is programming here. Let's quickly run this test to check whether this test passes or fails. And yes, it passes. Similarly, we can access the value at index 1, which is reading. And let's see whether this test passes. And yes. Oh, let me change its name as well. So that's how you can access the values stored within a list using their particular index. If we talk about this test, we are validating the value of ID key, which is getting returned to us in the response, which should be same what we have passed in our request body. And if you notice in the tests tab, I have passed this as a hard-coded value, which means that if I want to change the ID value in my request body from 1, let's say, to 2, then I have to make sure I go back in my tests tab and update this value here. So is there any way that instead of passing this as a hard-coded value, we could directly access the value of ID from the request body and pass that here in our test? Thanks to Postman, we can do that. Like we access the entire response and stored it in a variable, we can do same for request body. Let's see how. First of all, we'll need to declare a variable similar to our response. Then Unlike the way we access the response, there is some change. So we need to directly call the request object and then dot operator, and then we have to make a call to its data attribute. Now this will return us the entire data that we are passing in our request body. Now it can be in any format, but we have to make it change to the JSON. And for that purpose, we have to make call to another method called JSON.parse, and make sure you use JSON in its capitalized form. And then we pass the request.data as an argument to this method. Now this will parse the entire request body into JSON and then store it into a variable called JSON request. We quickly check printing this variable to make sure everything is fine. Console.log JSON request, and then let me quickly hit send button. Let's see console, and yes, the variable which holds our request body is getting printed. Now since the JSON request variable holds the entire JSON request body, I can access the ID key directly using dot operator in the same way I accessed it in my response. So let's quickly do it. Instead of passing it a hard-coded value here, let's use the variable JSON request and then put a dot operator and then simply call its ID key. Now it will put the value of ID key which is being passed in request body here in the expected value. And then it will compare the value of ID key which is getting returned to us in the response. Now it should pass. Let's try. Let's go to test results, and yes, it passes. Now, if I go in my request body and change the value of ID key here, I need not to change same in my test. Let's try this. And yes, it still passes. So that's how you can access the request body that you have passed in your request in tests tab. In Postman, variables allow you to store some data for some time, which can be reused later somewhere else. There can be 4 types of variables in Postman, depending upon their scope. And the first one comes global variable. A global variable is a variable which is created at one place but can be used anywhere in the Postman. Then comes environment variables, where you can have multiple copies of same variable in different environments. And as soon as you change the environment, the corresponding values of the variable belonging to that environment will be used. Then comes collection variables, a variable which can be used by all the requests belonging to the same collection. And then comes local variables whose scope is limited to only one request. Now let's see variables in action. I have got 2 requests here in my course collection. Let's assume the first one will be used to obtain a token, which will be subsequently used in the second request. So this is the first request and token is getting returned in the response. So what I will do, I will save the value of this token key in a variable which will be used in the second request. So let's quickly jump to the tests tab, and I'll be making use of collection variables to store the value of this token because the next request is also within the same collection. First of all, I'll need to access the value of this token by accessing the response. And we already know how do we access the response. So let's quickly declare a variable called JSON data in which we will store the response. Once we have stored the response, we can simply access the token key using dot operator. And let's also store that in another variable called token. Now we will simply store this token variable in the list of collection variables. Let's see how we can do that. We'll simply write pm dot collection variables dot set. This set method is used to either create a new variable or update an existing one. This method takes 2 arguments. The first one is the key of the variable, which will be used to reference it later, and the second one would be the value of the variable. Let's say the key is access token and the value is there in the token variable. So that's how we can create a collection variable. Now let's see how we can access it in the next request. I am now jumping to the second request where I'll be using this collection variable. Let's assume the token that we stored in the first request has to be passed as a header in the second request. So I'll create a new header called auth, and in its value, I'll simply pass the variable. And for that purpose, I'll simply type 2 opening curly braces. Then I will type the key of the collection variable, which was access token, and then I will type 2 closing curly braces. Now, if you click outside and hover your mouse over the variable, it says unresolved variable. This is because we did write our code in our previous request to create this collection variable, but we didn't execute that. So let's first execute that code so that this variable can be created. Let's quickly send the first request. And now Jump back to the second request and hover your mouse. Now you can see the value has been updated. It shows the current value of the variable and also shows the scope of the variable, which is collection in our case. If you are using a variable, which can be collection variable, global variable, or environment variable, anywhere but not in the code, then you have to access that variable in the same way within a pair of double curly braces. However, if you want to access the variable in your automated test, then we can do that in the same way we created it. That is by typing pm dot collection variables dot instead of set, we will call get and we'll pass the key. Similarly, we can create and use global variables by typing globals instead of collection variables after pm object, and then comes setters and getters. And if you wish to use environment variables, then you can do so by typing environment after pm object, and then comes setters and getters. Similarly, if you wish to use local variables, then you can do so by typing variables after pm object, and then comes setters and getters. Just remember, all the set methods take two arguments, first one being the key of the variable and second one being the value. However, get methods take only key of the variable. No one would ever want to test an API with same data again and again. Also, thinking of new random data every time is not easy. Thanks to Postman, it has the facility of dynamic random variables which generate sample data randomly, which is not gibberish and meaningless and can be used as a valid test data in your request. I have got the same post endpoint here to which I can post any data in JSON. And as of now, the keys first name, last name, and country have the hard coded values. And I want every time I hit the send button, some new random data should be generated and passed to the server. So what I will do, instead of this hard coded value, I'll put a double pair of curly braces, and within that I'll put a dollar symbol. And then I will get a list of all the random variables available in the Postman. Since this is going to be the value of first name key, then after dollar symbol, I'll type random first name. Similarly, for last name, I'll type random last name. And for country, it will be random country. We have a long list of random variables in Postman, which can be used for almost all frequently used piece of information. Now let's quickly hit send button and see what data is generated for us. Yes, we have got a valid first name, a valid last name, and a valid country. If we hit send button again, then again new data will be generated randomly. So yes. So that's how we can use sample data in Postman, which is valid yet random. Let's say I have an endpoint which accepts full name in its request body. And I have two collection variables, let's say first name and last name, which are being populated from some another API. So I'll need to first combine both the first name and last name variables and store their combination into a new variable and eventually pass that new variable here in the request body against full name key. And for that purpose, we have a pre-request section where we can write some code which will be executed before the actual request is made. So we will write the code to combine first name and last name and store it into a new variable here in the pre-request section. Let's create a variable fname and store the collection variable first name into it. Similarly, let's create another variable called lname and store collection variable last name into it. Now I will create a new variable, let's say full name, and will store the combination of fname and last name into it with a space in between. And finally, let's store this full name variable into a collection variable. Let's name it full name and then store the local variable full name into it. Since this full name collection variable will be created or updated before the actual request is made, therefore I can safely use it within my request body. And as you already know, we can use collection variable or any other variable in the request body by using double pair of square brackets and typing the name of the variable you want to use. Now let's hit send button and see if the combination of both first name and last name is getting passed. And yes, it is. I had already created first name and last name collection variables in my collection. And by the way, to view the collection variables in your collection, you can click on these three dots next to your collection name and then click on edit and then head to the variable section where you will get the entire list. And if you notice, this first name and last name variables were already there, and this full name variable was created by our code which was written in the pre-request section. Please note, I have written the logic of combining first name and last name here just to demonstrate the purpose of pre-request section. However, particular to this scenario, I can directly combine both the variables within the body itself. So instead of accessing full name here, I'll first access first name collection variable and then I'll put a space within the double quotes and then I'll access the another collection variable which is last name. So in this way, I could have directly combined both of them and passed them in the request body. And yes, it is returning the same result. We learned how do we create a new request in Postman, how do we pass request body, and how do we verify response. However, we have not saved any request so far. The purpose of saving a request is to keep it persistent, reuse it whenever required, and in fact share it with the team members. Let's see how we can save a request in our Postman. If you notice, in all the requests that I have opened in my Postman, they have an orange icon at the end, which indicates all of them are either not saved or have been modified since their last save point. In order to save a request in Postman, you need to press Ctrl S. And if you are saving your request for the first time, then it will ask you to specify the collection name in which you want to save your request. A collection, as the name suggests, is a collection of requests, or you can say that it's a logical grouping of requests. In Postman, a request can only be saved within a collection. I'll create a new collection to save my this request. Let's name it course and then click on create button. Once the collection is created, you will get the save button enabled. And once you click here, your request will be saved in the collection. And both the collection and the request will appear in the left pane. Now we will check out a real world API, which is open to public and free for use. We will understand how it works and then we'll try to put some automated basic assertions on it. And then finally, we will understand how we can make our Postman requests pick test data from an external file. I have already created a collection here which has one request, and this request makes a use of public API which takes a pin code of a particular location as an input in its path parameter and returns all the details available against that pin code. If you want to use this public API, then you simply need to put this request URL in your Postman request and then select get as a request method and then simply enter the pin code whose details you want to fetch. Now I have already entered a pin code of my city Amritsar. Now if I click on send, then I should get all the details available next to this pin code. So yes, we have received a response from the server and now let's quickly examine its structure. This API returns me a list because the response starts from a square bracket and ends at a square bracket. Within this list, there is a single object which has all the information included. The first key is the message, which indicates how many post offices were found against this pin code. And then there is a status key, which simply represents the status. And then we have a post office key, which is further a list of objects, and each object within it represents one post office against this pin code. Now, if I enter a pin code which does not exist, a random one maybe, then I will get an error. If you notice, the status code here is 200 only. However, the message indicates that no records were found. And similarly, the value of status key is error instead of success, and the post office key is null. So if I want to test this negative scenario through automation as well, then I'll probably need to put an assertion on one of the keys within the response instead of the status code, which is 200 in this case as well. Now we will create two requests, one for valid pin code and another for invalid pin code. And then we will put assertions accordingly in both of them. I have already renamed this request to valid pin code, and let me quickly change this random pin code to a valid one. Now for the sake of simplicity, we will put only two assertions. One, the status code should always be 200, and second, the value of the status key should be success in the case of valid pin code. So let's quickly jump to tests tab. I'll be making use of code snippets to put assertions to do it quickly. Let me first put an assertion on status code to be 200, and then let's make use of this code snippet response body JSON value check to verify the value of status key, which we will update according to our logic. The second test here is simply used to verify a value within the response, which we have to update according to our response. Let me first quickly change its name to, let's say, status should be success. And in the body, I am already storing the response in a variable called JSON data. And using this variable, I simply have to reach out to this status key. As the structure of the response is a list, which further contains a single object, we can first access this object using zero index. So after JSON data variable, which holds the entire response, I'll simply put a zero index. Now I have reached to this object, and further I can access the status key using dot operator. So instead of value, we will put status here. Now, as I am automating a valid pin code scenario, so I expect the value of status key should be success. Now let's quickly hit send button and see if both of the assertions work. And no, one assertion fails. So what does it say? Expected success to be deeply equals to success. Oh yeah, so S in the success word has to be capital. If we go back to our response, we see that S is capital in the success. So now let's try again. We have got the response. Let's quickly jump to test result, and yes, both of the assertions pass. Now since this was for a valid pin code, let's quickly create one request for invalid pin code. And for that purpose, I'll simply creating a duplicate copy of this request. By creating duplicate copy, I get every piece of information copied itself. Let me first change its name to, let's say, invalid pin code. And then let's put an invalid pin code itself, which can be anything random. And then in the test tab, we will simply change its success to error message. Now let's try if it works. So we have got the response. Let's quickly jump to test results, and yes, both of the assertions pass. Oh, we can also change the name of the test. As of now, I have only two requests in my collection, each depicting one scenario. So I can simply open both of them and then hit the send button manually to test both the scenarios. However, in a situation where there are 100 requests, let's say, each depicting one scenario, hitting the send button individually will not be feasible. Here comes collection runner to our rescue, where we can select one or more than one collections, and all the requests available in those collections will be hit automatically. In order to access the collection runner, you have to navigate to file menu and then choose new runner tab option from there. A new window will appear where you will need to drag and drop the collections that you want to run through runner. Here you get the list of all the requests available in that collection, and all of them are selected by default. If you want to deselect any of them, you can also do that. And once you deselect, that request will not be run by the runner. Let me select this request back again because I want to run both of them. And then I can configure iterations, means the number of times I want to run my entire collection. And then I can also configure delay in milliseconds between each iteration. And then I can also select data file for external data, which we'll talk about later. Rest of the options I'll keep as is, and then I'll simply hit this run button. And yes, I have got the report of the collection runner where the two requests in my collection were hit automatically and test assertions of both of them are pass. This tool of Postman is very useful when your collection has a considerable number of requests and you want to run all of them in one go. Data plays a vital role in API testing. The more number of different data sets you can test your API against, the more confidence you get to ensure that your API is production ready. However, the real challenge is of manually testing your API against all those possible different data sets. Once again, the collection runner of Postman comes to our rescue. So using collection runner, we can do data-driven testing of our API, in which we can have all the different data sets or simply put all the varieties of test data in an external file whose format can be any one of the supported formats like CSV or Excel, and then integrate that external file with the collection. And then the collection runner will run your collection for all the data sets available in the data file. Now let's see this in action. I have already created a collection called data driven tests with single request, which makes use of same pin code API we have used earlier. In this API, we have to give pin code as an input in the endpoint itself. And then from test standpoint, we have got two tests here. One is the status code should be 200, and considering the input pin code is valid, the message in the status key should be success. In data driven testing, we take input as well as the expected result from the data source. Therefore, this pin code and the expected value of the status key should come from the data file. And for that purpose, let's first create a test data file. I have already created a CSV file for test data, and you can also go with Excel file if you want. In this data file, I have got two columns. The first one is pin code, whose values will go as input to the API. And the second column is of result, which depicts the value of the status key corresponding to each pin code. Now let's quickly integrate this data file with the Postman request. So here, instead of the hard-coded input, I will type a pair of double curly braces and then will type the name of the column whose values I want to be put here while running this collection through the collection runner. So here was the name of the pin code column which I typed here. Now don't worry if this says unresolved variable, because this variable will be created and populated when we will be running this through collection runner. Similarly, we need to access the value of second column called result within our second test for the value of status key. So for that, let me first create a variable called expected status, and within its value, let's type pm dot iteration data dot get, and within this get method, we'll specify the name of the column whose values we want to be put here. So when we will be running this collection through the collection runner by integrating it with the data file, then for each iteration, the corresponding row of data will be put into this iteration data object, and then calling the get method will return the value of the specified column. Now instead of this hard-coded success value, we'll simply pass the variable expected status. Now let's quickly save this collection, and then in the next video, we'll see how we can run it through collection runner. Now let's quickly open the collection runner by navigating to file menu and then new runner tab. Here we'll select the data driven test collection, and then we will select the data file with which we want to integrate this collection. Now if you notice, the format of the data file has been automatically set to CSV in our case, and similarly the number of iterations has automatically been configured to the number of rows available in the data file. Now if we click on this preview button, it will show the data available in the data file. Now let's quickly click on this button and see what we get. So yes, there were 5 datasets available in the data file, and for each of them, the collection was run and corresponding tests were executed. Now you can also choose to export these test results from here into a JSON file, which can be further used to publish these results onto your organization's test dashboard.